Irish Times editor Geraldine Kennedy and the paper's public affairs correspondent Colm Keena have been ordered by the High Court to answer the Mahon Tribunal's questions about the source for an article written last year about payments to the Taoiseach. The two now face the dilemma of risking identifying a source or potentially being jailed for contempt.
Irish Times editor Geraldine Kennedy and correspondent Colm Keena left the High Court this morning disappointed and facing a dilemma.
It was in the public interest to publish the story, I believe. And having done so, I feel an obligation to protect sources, so I'm very disappointed.
In September last year, the newspaper published an article based upon a leaked confidential letter from the Mahon Tribunal to a businessman. The letter referred to private investigations being carried out by the tribunal into payments made to Bertie Ahern in the early 1990s. The journalists later refused to identify their source to the tribunal, but revealed they had destroyed the unsolicited documents they'd received. The tribunal then went to the High Court, seeking orders compelling the journalists to cooperate. In its reserved judgment, the court today granted those orders. It ruled that the tribunal had ample legal powers to conduct an investigation into the source of the leak and had the right to impose an obligation of confidentiality on people it was corresponding with and third parties. The court also criticised the journalists' decision to destroy the documents, calling it an astounding and flagrant disregard of the law. Such a way of proceeding, it said, was anathema to the rule of law and an affront to the democratic order. Journalists are not above the law and are not entitled to usurp the function of the court, as happened here, it said. The court concluded the document's destruction meant it was less likely that questioning the journalists would lead to identification of the source. The National Union of Journalists said the disappointing result would have serious implications for journalism. The two journalists said they would consider all the options. Are you willing to go to jail?
Well, nobody would say that they would willingly want to go to jail, but I stand firmly over the view that the protection of sources is a core principle of journalism.
The case is due back before the court in a fortnight, when the journalists will have to indicate their intentions. Will Goodbody, RTE News at the High Court.
Still to come on tonight, the Irish Times editor Geraldine Kennedy and the paper's public affairs correspondent Colm Keena have been ordered by the High Court to tell the Mahon Tribunal the source for a written article last year about payments to Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. Well, we're staying with that because we're joined here in studio by Michael Keeley, who's a lawyer specialising in media and in defamation and in media issues and in the issue of sources and journalists protecting their sources. The High Court has been very critical today of the Irish Times on one point in particular, Michael Keeley, and that is the fact that Geraldine Kennedy destroyed the documents on which this now famous article about the Taoiseach's payments to Taoiseach was based, and that they say was simply unacceptable.
It does. And they presented this as journalists portraying themselves as above the law. I think what was particularly bad from the court's perspective was first that they destroyed the documents, but secondly they destroyed the documents after the tribunal had asked them to give them to them.
And they say, I mean, it's worth just reminding ourselves of what they said. They said that was an astounding and flagrant disregard of the rule of law, that it was an anathema to the rule of law and an affront to the democratic order.
It was, and it is very, very severe criticism of the Irish Times. Having said that, to use another great media quote, they would say that, wouldn't they? Courts obviously have to uphold the rule of law. The Irish Times don't think that they're any worse off by destroying the documents. They're saying, look, we wouldn't reveal the source, we wouldn't give you the document that would allow you to see that. The fact that we were asked afterwards, got rid of it afterwards, really doesn't make a big difference.
But the basis for this, the basis for them arguing this way is the fact that they believe that there is protection for journalists to protect their sources. That if you look particularly at European law, there's every likelihood that they would have been able to protect those sources and keep that confidentiality.
There is. The European courts are very, very clear. They say freedom of expression is hugely important, and the only way that you can get information out into the public domain in a large number of matters is by allowing confidential sources. The problem has been that the Irish law has always been a bit slower to catch up with that. Irish law has traditionally said journalists like yourself are no different than any other citizen.
Now, the result of today's decision is that these two journalists have to go back to the Mahon Tribunal, and they've been told they have to answer the questions that the Mahon Tribunal puts to them. Now, what's that likely to lead to?
I don't anticipate that the Irish Times are going to turn around and say, yes, we're going to give you the information. There may be an amount of wriggle room which will allow them to reach a conclusion, which is effectively to say, well, it didn't come from the tribunal, and that's really what you're looking at. And there may be some form of compromise that could arise out of that. But I do not expect either Colm Keena or Geraldine Kennedy to reveal their source. And frankly, if they are asked that question, they are going to face jail.
And how prepared do you think would be, presumably come to the High Court to make that decision, how prepared would a judge be to send a newspaper editor to jail?
They would be very slow to do that. In many ways, you tend to make a martyr of a journalist when you do that. We've seen that in the United States with the Judith Miller case, which is about 100 days behind bars because she refused to reveal her source. So they will be slow to do that. But the reality is that if there is a flagrant contempt of court, they may be left with no option.
So we could be facing really a major struggle, and perhaps a defining struggle between the courts and the tribunals and the rights, as journalists see it, to protect their sources and to report a story.
This is a major constitutional crisis, and it's a major constitutional crisis reflected in the fact that the decision today was from 3 judges in the High Court, which is highly unusual. This case, I suspect, may well go to the Supreme Court. It may well go to Europe after all of this. But it is a major, major issue.
All right, Michael Keeley, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.